go.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of ASCII Anything, brought to you by Moser Consulting. I'm your host, Angel Leon, Moser's Director of Personnel. We're glad that you're with us for this episode of ASCII Anything because today we're going to be discussing managing remote IT projects. Managing remote IT projects comes with unique challenges, from coordinating distributed teams to ensuring seamless communication and collaboration. Success hinges on leveraging the right tools, setting clear expectations, and fostering a strong team culture despite physical distance. With the right strategies, remote IT projects can be just as efficient and productive as in-person teams, if not more. To talk about managing remote IT projects, we have one of our own, Derrick Spires, one of our senior consultants here at Moser Consulting. Let's welcome our guest, Derrick Spires. Derrick, how are you? Welcome back to ASCII Anything.
I'm doing great. Thanks, Angel. I appreciate having me on again.
We certainly appreciate you joining us again on ASCII Anything to talk about this. I think we've talked about managing projects before. I don't think we've talked about managing remote IT projects before. So I'm really looking forward to this. This is one of those things that you don't think about until you need it. And then when you need it, you're like, wait, what? How do I do this again? So let's start with the basics before we dive into remote managing an IT project. In your experience, what is the main difference between remote managing an IT project and managing an IT project in person?
After 2020, this has certainly become the case. But a lot of IT organizations deal with remote projects just because of the nature of the resources and the people that they leverage being sometimes on the other side of the world, even before 2020, but certainly has been elevated since that time. But obviously the biggest difference that sticks out to me and anyone that's had to do this type of work is really the relational aspect and the nature of the way that we communicate with one another, as opposed to face when you can have spontaneous, organic interactions with team members as little as getting up from your desk and walking over and asking questions to catching up on what's going on in their life. Those things are all relatively easy and help with cultivating that strong team camaraderie and engagement. Obviously, with remote situations, you don't have that aspect, and it's something that you really, as a project manager, have to lean into and have to focus on intentionally. I think of projects that I've had in the past where in the face-to-face settings, we might be in a team setting talking about a specific problem, or we're trying to resolve an issue. And as the team's discussing, I can look at people's faces and look at their mannerisms and see maybe they have a thought that they're not yet sharing or vocalizing, but I can see by their body language that there's something on their mind. That's a lot easier to do when you have that face-to-face connection. In a remote setting, you may not be on camera. You may not be able to see that piece. So it's a tougher read to get there. The thing that sticks out to me the most, and one thing, frankly, I actually just had a conversation about this with some of my peers. We think about project management being such a relationship heavy profession. We're leading people without authority, and we have to have relationship to help get everybody united towards this common goal. But when we get to remote, one of the things that I see and I frankly struggle with is the one-on-one contact goes away because, well, we don't have time, or we can't just walk across the hall. But that's what brings a team together. And so it's something that I know for me, I've intentionally tried to build up in my repertoire and try and make those connections one-on-one when I can, albeit a little more challenging to do. So I think that's the biggest difference.
Just to piggyback off your last point there about not having those one-on-ones directly with those individuals right away. So let's say you finish a meeting when you're in person, those organically natural conversations that happen after those meetings end sometimes can provide as much power as the meeting itself.
Yes.
Because as you were mentioning, maybe that person that you can see the body language is not necessarily sharing their whole thoughts. But then maybe the second that meeting is over, you can say, hey, Joe, can you hold on for a second? Then you can get that context, maybe in a one-on-one setting where they feel more comfortable, right? Sharing their thoughts and maybe their feelings and maybe exactly what they're thinking about the project. And so you can get that extra context that maybe in a medium like this, where, okay, the meeting's over, it's 2:00. Okay, great. Everybody just hits end meeting, and unless that person has an urge big enough to actually say, hey, Derrick, I need to talk to you, man.
You're 100% correct. And actually, as you're talking through that, it makes me think of another problem that occurs because of the nature of that type of thing, right? In face-to-face meetings, we can leave that previous meeting and then go talk about the problem.
Yeah,
Oftentimes, if a problem's identified in a remote setting, you don't have the luxury of just jumping out, but that also means you're usually taking a day or two and you're losing a day or two in your project time to set
right.
up another meeting, even if you're aware of it. And
Yeah,
so there's just a natural inefficiency born out of that lack of face-to-face contact and being able to understand your people as clear as you can.
I agree. I think there's that cadence that you lose
Yeah,
because you lose that train of thought, you lose that thread, if you will, of having it in person where you may be able to reach out directly to that person right away, or maybe not right away. Maybe you wait a couple minutes because if it was a contentious meeting, right, you wait for everybody to cool off, and
sure.
then you kind of go back and say, okay, John, come on, let's sit down, let's get some coffee, etc. Whereas in a Zoom, Teams, etc., you just disconnect, and now you have
Yeah.
somebody stewing on their computer, you're stewing on your computer, and it's basically, you're you're having a
Yeah.
soup off, if you will, just between the two of you far away, but nobody's really communicating.
Then you add into another layer there too, right? Is if they didn't communicate in the meeting, usually it comes across in some type of written word, whether it's an email or something typed up in a Slack channel. That
Yeah,
adds another level of complexity because we don't get to see the person's tone when it's in the written word. We
right.
don't get to see, how did they intend that? We tend to put our own preconceived notions or tone on those when we read those emails, and we might be wrong about that. And so it's adds so much complexity having a remote setting compared to being face to face that you goes back to what I was saying earlier about really having to lean in and be diligent and disciplined as a project manager and trying to open up channels of communication, trying to build relationship despite these barriers that are introduced by the nature of the way that we're working.
Yeah, your role becomes much more important because I like the line you used earlier about being somebody that's leading this project without a leadership title.
Yeah.
Your role
Yeah,
really becomes that much important because
absolutely.
now you're kind of shepherding everything that's happening without, I hate to say, without no authority, but to yourself, you have an authority because you're leading the team
That's right.
to the common goal.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You're ultimately as a project manager accountable for the
Right.
performance of the project team. So 100% agree. It's
Yeah.
a great point.
So let's now go directly into remote IT project management. How do you begin that process? What strategies do you use when starting a remote IT project management project?
Yeah, I think you hit this as kind of one of the things we're talking about in the intro, and that's really setting clear expectations with your team. And that's obviously done right from the kickoff meeting, being comprehensive in that meeting, but laying out a framework within that, your project plan, your communications plan, your performance monitoring plan that is conducive and reflects the idea of trying to keep people engaged, trying to open lines of communication. So for example, one of the things that I try to do in my kickoff meetings, and you know, it's something that I'm trying to get regular at. Sometimes, depending on the project, it might shift and things, but I try to make sure I talk about here's the mechanisms and present those to all the members of the project team in the kickoff of the way we can communicate. One of the things that I found useful, a recent project that I had, we talked about using instead of a daily stand up where we all get on a call like we typically would do, or all come into a room for that 10-15 minute stand up. Instead, we do one call a week, but the other days are done through a Slack forum. And so when people get on, they know that the expectation is they'll come on and say, here's what I'm doing today. Here's the barriers that I need help removing. And here's what I had accomplished yesterday. And so we use Slack, and that allows people to still have the freedom to have their schedule. We still have an open line of communication of what people are working on, just as we would a stand up, but it accommodates the different time zones we might be in,
Yeah.
that maybe somebody on the other side of the world. So laying out that clear expectation of how we're going to communicate is important. I think the other thing is making sure they understand I'm going to be looking at our performance as a team, not to point a finger necessarily at a person or bring that person down, but the opposite. How do we then have a conversation, a common strategy that you hear in an agile type project is going to be the stop, start, continue type conversation. What should we start doing? We see these issues. Here's the performance that we had in the last sprint or the last milestone that we wanted to set. Here's the performance. What do we need to start doing to improve in these areas? What do we stop doing that might be holding us from doing better? And then what do we need to continue to? What's working well? And that also allows people the forum in which to engage and be heard and want to make their own lives easier and their own working life easier. So that's another expectation I try to set, that we're going to be monitoring this for us to have those conversations to ultimately improve the entire team's performance.
Yeah, those are great ways to start a remote IT project. I gotta say that that's really cool. And I like the addition of the Slack messaging, because I feel like to move away from the stand-up meeting every day, that, some people might view that as a challenge, but I think that introducing Slack and making it much more of an unofficial meeting,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Every morning and people checking in, that makes it, like you said, it still gives that connection. You're still engaged with the team,
Yeah.
rather than just, hey, we gotta sign on to this call. It's gonna last 5 minutes of my life, and I'm just gonna jump in there and smile, and maybe I don't have anything to say, maybe I do, and if I don't, I'm just there. I'm just looking at
Yeah.
my other screen just while everybody else is talking. But you remove that because that could be a distraction for some people. But then you add that element of Slack, and you're still engaged. You're still keeping them engaged. You're still
That's right.
keeping them in touch with the team.
Right. Oftentimes, too, they're recognizing that as their project manager, that they're looking to kind of guide the ship. They're recognizing someone that's interested in and mindful of their needs. They're not. They see someone accommodating the fact that, hey, I have a busy schedule. I can't just be available whenever you want me to, and you're letting me have that freedom to engage as I need, when I need. And so that's an important thing, because we're all professionals. You have these people on your team because they're the experts,
Right.
and it shows a level of trust in them, and thus they return that trust back to you. I
Yeah.
find one of the other things I wanted to mention that I do as well, and you can use this as Slack. I've done that in the past. I've used some other tools as well, but having a separate channel and some
Mm.
activities when we have those remote things that we kind of feed to the team, or having a fun little starter to your team meetings if you do have those formal team meetings that is not necessarily work specific. Just this morning, I had my opening thing. It was meet your fur babies. And it was a chance for
Uh,
every team member to kind of show, here's my pet. Tell us about their dog, their cat, whatever their pet is, or a previous pet. It just opens up the door to that. And the last thing I'll say, some things that I've noticed or have had challenges with, was when you run into cultural issues, right? Because we work with people across the other side of the world. They have a different cultural norms than we do here in the States. Obviously, they work different hours, much different hours oftentimes. So it's always important to be mindful of those pieces. It might take someone from a different culture, it might take some extra work and recognition for them to open up when we talk about sprint planning and backlog grooming and their participation in those types of activities, because from a cultural standpoint, it might not be the way they operate. So it's
right.
important to keep mindful of that and put in approaches and tactics to overcome those challenges as well.
Yeah, and I'd say to that, even not just a cultural aspect of it, but just the way they might do business on their side, on their
Yes.
country, that you use that terminology. Maybe they don't use that terminology. Maybe they do
Yes.
something similar, but they don't necessarily call it that. And so
Yeah.
while you're using that terminology to them, they might be looking at you like, what is this? And it is
Right.
until you explain what it is and what it means to us, and they might come back and say, oh yeah, we do that, we just call it this. So that those are things, as you mentioned, that even inside our own country, like people from the East Coast and the West Coast, like there's differences just within the country in the way we
Yes.
do things. So it's a challenge in and of itself, but it's a good challenge, right? Because I feel like everybody learns through the process, and they learn and make it a lot better for everybody involved. But
Yeah.
let's talk about engagement. Talked a little bit about engaging and kind of keeping the team together. How do you
Mhm.
maintain team engagement and motivation in a remote setting when managing an IT project?
It's a huge challenge, especially since it's hard to monitor kind of where someone's at. You can get the sense of, someone kind of withdrawing, someone dealing with perhaps feeling siloed. That's much easier to identify if you're in the office together and
Yeah.
you see their mannerisms. Over a remote setting, it's much more difficult. And I go back to that whole idea. As project managers, I truly believe our profession is its foundation is based upon relationship. We cannot be successful as project. I know for me, I am not a coder. I am not a database expert. I know enough that I would be dangerous to any of my projects. So I have to put my trust in those people, and they have to trust me. And that is all built on a foundation of relationship. And so with that, I think, as I mentioned this before, it strikes me, and this is something that I've thought about just recently, that I observe when I consult with other organizations. I've even now reflect on my own performance. We get in these remote settings, and one of the first things we do is drop the behaviors that we typically would have if we were in a face-to-face setting. And what I mean by those behaviors, I mean intentionally seeking out somebody just to check in on them,
Yeah.
right? Intentionally investing in them as a person. How is their spouse doing? How are their children doing? How is the hobby that they have doing? We kind of drop those things, and it's easy to drop because they're not sitting next to us any longer.
Right.
But it's those types of those things that help you as a project manager identify when someone is getting unengaged or kind of backing away from the team. It also helps you understand their motivation. What
Right.
what is their motivation? Everyone is motivated differently. Some people, you have your high performers that are driven just by sheer excellence. You have others that, hey, they're trying to make sure their children have a means to excel beyond them. And you have others that this is just the industry itself is their passion. And knowing those motivations is going to be important for you to know, how do I talk to this person in such a way that they're bought into pulling on the same side of the rope as everyone else. And if you don't have that relationship, if you abandon or withdraw from doing those things that help you understand your people, you're going to have a very difficult time as a project manager. And I've had a difficult time when I had done that, being able to motivate those folks or find what makes them tick and keep them engaged in my project. So I think the relationship piece just can't be stressed enough. And when it comes to remote, in fact, I would tell you it's even more vital than when you're in a face-to-face setting.
Yeah, I'd agree because I think one thing that remote work has introduced throughout the last 4 or 5 years has been that is that if you don't build up that relationship, if you don't build up that rapport with your team, as you mentioned, you won't know what ticks, you won't know what makes them want to go, you won't know what makes them want to stop.
Yeah.
And if you don't have those tidbits of knowledge in your toolbox, then I hate to say it, but you're probably going to fail.
Yeah. And what I said earlier, right? You're doing this without authority. You're not there. They don't directly report to you, right? It's not
Yeah.
like you have some HR motivated trigger that you can put
Yeah.
in front of them to force motivation. Not that that's a healthy way to do it anyway, but
Right. No,
uh,
no, no, no.
it makes it even more vital that this relationship piece is established. But one of the other things I think of as you kind of gave me some feedback there is doing so, you have to be willing to show your own vulnerability,
Yep.
right? You have to be willing to say, one of the things I always say in my projects, I'm probably the dumbest guy in the room when I'm talking to you all about this project. You all the experts, so help me educate myself. But being vulnerable in front of your team is okay. In fact,
Mhm.
it's going to build credibility and trust with your team. Now, if you're constantly throwing yourself under the bus and
Yeah.
making yourself sound silly and those type things, that's obviously not the right level. But it's the willingness to be vulnerable at the appropriate times that's important. It adds to your credibility. It helps people trust you more because they recognize that you don't see yourself more than what you are, just a person trying to help them get the job done.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think showing that vulnerability is key, but like you mentioned, you show it in spurts, right? You show
Sure.
it in spots where you feel like you need to maybe motivate, maybe show that you are just like
Yeah,
them. You have struggles, you have situations that you're worried about outside of maybe these four walls. And that, as you mentioned, goes a long way in building rapport, building relationship. And in the end, I think it just helps strengthen that environment as a whole.
100%.
So, what are some of the best practices for tracking progress and productivity in remote projects?
Yeah, obviously there's a myriad of tools out there that you can leverage. If you're an agile shop or working agile, as most organizations have moved to some hybrid approach, whether it's Jira, Monday.com, you have a myriad of tools at your disposal to support those milestones. I think one of the biggest factors that you could be looking at as a project manager, and it seems simple, but just did we deliver in the time that we said we were? Whether that's in a sprint setting where we have 2-week sprints, did we deliver all the tasks that we wanted to within that 2 weeks? And then being open, and again, we set the expectation at the beginning that we're going to talk about when we don't hit those things, not to point a finger at a person or tell a person that they did poorly, but to understand what stopped them from achieving that goal so that we can remove the barriers or we can implement something that helps them get that the next time. So I think there's a myriad of tools out there. I think the biggest thing is being diligent on what's important for you and your team to measure. You may have a history with your team as a project manager. It might not be the first time you're working with them. Looking at kind of lessons learned and former retrospectives to help guide, here's what I'm going to measure in this project as a team performance, not just is the product of quality that you're ultimately sending out or the feature that you deliver at the end of a sprint. That's not the only thing you should be under. It should, how's the team performing? And I think there's a host of things you could use, but in bringing the team into the conversation of what do we want to look at this time? What do we want to measure is also a vital piece. Gets them bought into the idea of here's what we need to improve on.
You mentioned a couple of things. One that we use here at Jira specifically, I personally use it, and I think it's wonderful to track. If you're in a project where you need to track tasks, for example, that's a great tool, obviously, because you're creating tickets, etc. You're going after, you see the time frame, how long it takes to complete each ticket. So it's a great tool. But I think, as you mentioned, every project is different, and not necessarily all tools will be perfect for that project. You just have to make sure that you're adapting that project to the best tool and the best knowledge for your team that your team can use in order to be productive, and you as a project manager can track that progress.
Yeah, it's important too to bring in the leadership groups as stakeholders in the conversation. Again, because ultimately we can look at things we want to improve upon, but we want everyone to be focused on that. So managers of developers and managers of database engineers, I want them also asking a question, well, how are we performing in this area? So I want to be able to report that back to them so they can have the conversations, because if our team is struggling with a certain performance aspect, usually we're not the only team struggling with that. That's typically something that is a symptom across an organization. And so if we're looking to remedy that, we're hopefully remedying it across the entire set of the department or the company in some cases.
So let's really quickly move on. What are some of the key challenges in managing remote IT projects, and how can they be overcome?
Yeah, so we talked a little bit about the communication piece. Obviously, communication breakdowns are going to occur. You don't pick up on those nonverbal cues that you can usually pick up on. Putting in place forums and different methods in which people can provide feedback openly, and depending on the team and how well your relationship has grown with them, you might be able to have it anonymous, whether that's giving them surveys to take or just even I've used in the past a Google Doc where people can throw a sticky note up on a Google Doc. And we talk about a team, but it's done anonymously. I just bring out that somebody submitted this. Let's talk about this. It's having those, as I mentioned before, the start-stop continuation type discussion, trying to make sure that people have a voice in which they can express where they feel things might be needing improvement. Being mindful of cultural issues and time zones is important for us as project managers. I think being willing to, I have a peer, one of the things he does is he rotates the weekly meetings that he has. So they're not always the same time every day each week. They might be an evening meeting. One is for the morning, next week it's the morning meeting. So it kind of shares the load or the burden of this, of just the nature of our work. So that's a tactic that you might be able to use. I think measuring performance, having something that is pointing you to data-driven conversations is vital in these situations, especially since we don't have the relational aspect. I always have a struggle with those conversations where it's solely based upon how I feel. Because really the other person says, I don't feel that way. I feel differently. Okay, well, is there really a problem then? Or as opposed to if I have some type of data that's pointing to the issue, right? Then there's an objective source that's pointing to this, and it becomes a problem we're trying to solve together, as opposed to I feel this, you feel that. It's maybe somewhere in between, but we don't really know. So having data-driven type discussions is so vital when it comes to performance.
I like that example about the meetings at different time frames to accommodate different time zones. That's actually a very neat idea, and it's actually very refreshing to hear. We get so used to, right, the cadence of having meetings at the same time, at the same time, same channel, different same time, etc.
Yeah.
And that's actually very refreshing to hear that there's someone out there who's taking into consideration somebody else who lives in a different time zone and how they can accommodate that, so that maybe they're not the ones that have to get up at 11, 12 midnight while you guys are over here at 9 a.m. So that's actually pretty neat.
Yeah, you think of our partners that we might be working with overseas. I put myself in their shoes. If I'm always the one expected to get up at midnight to take a call because that's what happens to be, I'm gonna feel a certain way about that. I'm the one that has to take the hit all the time. And by sharing that across, it's all right. As a team, we all have to work around this. There's going to be times that it sucks, but there's other times that okay, it's during my normal business days, and it keeps that unity, or at least keeps some sense of animosity maybe could percolate away from the team.
No, but that talks a lot to what we were talking about earlier about engagement and motivation. I mean, the fact that if I live in Europe and I know that I'm 6-7 hours ahead of Eastern time zone here in the US, then a meeting that's at 1 p.m. for you guys over here, for me it's 8 o'clock at night. That's gonna be hard because I what if I have a family? What if I have other things that I like to do at that time? Whereas now I have to accommodate my time zone because I work for this company that is US based or vice versa. It doesn't matter, but I still have to be at those meetings. So it would be nice if taken into consideration, hey, let's start a meeting at 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. So that way it's 2 p.m. for me or 9, etc. So that way it's at least in the confines of right working hours. I mean, we have it here in the US. We have meetings. I mean, the time of this recording is 2:37. So if I was living in Europe, for me, it would be what, at 8, 9 p.m. So
that's right. Right. Yeah.
So
no, you're spot
having
on.
this conversation and you'll be over there working. I was like, man, I really want to go to bed. I'm having this conversation over here.
That's right. Or I want to get to my kid's soccer game or whatever it is. You're spot on. You're spot on.
Yeah. So all right. So before we go, we've talked about team engagement, motivation, good practices for tracking progress and productivities and challenges. What are some of the ways that you measure the success of a remote IT project?
Yeah, of course, there's obviously the obvious and traditional way. Did we deliver to the expectations of ultimately the end user or the client? So I'm gonna kind of bypass that because that's a known. But I think one of the biggest thing is finding ways to measure team satisfaction. One of the things that I try to when I've stood up a PMO on my previously in work or helped another organization standing up the end of team retrospective, I advise people to have a third party, whether it's someone else in the organization or someone else they bring in that wasn't involved with the project or the team at all, to come in and actually facilitate kind of a recap of the project. Again, what went well, what didn't. But one of the questions I want to ask is, would you work with this project manager again? Well, how do you feel? Would you want to, and let them know it's anonymous, but getting that feedback as a measure from a project manager perspective, that kind of will give you insight into where things are. And you want to be a third party because you want them to give candid, free, and open feedback to you. And take that to heart, right? Whatever that feedback is, hopefully we all get people wanting to work with us, but there's been times people have told me, they don't want to work with me again. And it's easy to point a finger and say, well, so-and-so, you didn't do this. You need to take a breath and look at it as a project manager. Okay, well, next time, what could I have done differently? So I think that's a big part of project success. That's kind of below the surface. I think seeking out stakeholder feedback on how the project team performed, whether it's the clients or third party, even even our maybe contractors that were involved in the team, how did they interact with the project team? Did it feel difficult? Were they hard to work with? Were they easy to work with? What made it easy? What made it difficult? I think there's measures there that indicate to you the success of your project that are underlying, and then some basic things of looking back and saying, how were we compared to our estimation throughout this process? When we put together a sprint in our sprint planning sessions, how many times did we have something roll over? How many times did we have to add to our sprint because we got through it more quickly than we thought we would? Is our velocity accurate? Did it get better over time as we move through the project, or did it always fluctuate wildly? Well, that's if it fluctuated wildly, there's an issue there. There's an issue with the project. Now, it might be an external force that's causing that, but it still points to something where we can take back and evaluate and hopefully improve for any future project teams we have, but more importantly, the organization as a whole. So I think it's those things that go kind of below the surface of if a project is healthy or successful that I like to look at.
Those are good pointers because obviously direct feedback from the customer, that's always going to be king. But
Absolutely.
if you want to drill down and get really good feedback, I like the option of the anonymous feedback that you mentioned at the beginning, just because, as you mentioned, sometimes it's hard for people to really talk out loud about, hey, I had this experience, or I wouldn't work with this project manager again, etc. And for the receiving end of that message, as you mentioned, I think that's where we gotta take back, talk again about the remote option where you hang up the call and you're like, you're frustrated. Well, you gotta take a second and breathe in and don't let that get to you on a personal level. Obviously, if it's bad feedback, just take a step back, breathe in, really
Yes.
read into the weeds, not necessarily get into the attach mode that, oh man, it's attacking me. It's like, no, just read it and try to put some thought into it. I know sometimes negative feedback can be really hard, but if you really want to grow as a professional, as an individual, that's when you take that and you get it,
Yes.
sustain it, and then just think
Yeah.
it through
It's
and think the places where you might have been able to do things differently, etc. But I like that anonymous feedback piece because sometimes we get so latched on to maybe the customer was very happy, so it's, oh great, I did a great job because the customer was happy. Well, what about the team around you?
That's right. That's right. And vice versa, right?
Yeah,
Maybe
yeah,
that client introduced a lot of challenges, and so maybe they weren't as happy at the end. But as a
yeah,
team, we felt like, man, worked really well together. We did the best we could. Well, we shouldn't lose sight of that either, because
right.
there's things that we did well. Let's keep doing those things. So it's both ends of the spectrum there. I think one of the things you're hitting on is one of the biggest challenges when we seek out feedback. And I haven't really found I don't think anybody's really found a clear, effective, true way to do this, but most people don't want to bring people down. They when they give feedback, they don't want to hurt somebody's feelings, even if it's anonymous. And
Yeah,
so they always filter those things, which is fair. It's human nature. At the same time, on the other side of the coin, as project managers, when we get that feedback, I guarantee you the way to ensure that you never get a clear picture or the full truth is to have reactions where you immediately point to excuses first
right.
um, when you receive the feedback, right? If the first reaction I have is, well, that was messed up because of XYZ or so and
Yeah,
so or those type things, people aren't going to be as willing to be as open and transparent as
true.
opposed to, you know what, that is great. I would love to know more of what caused that. Can we look into that again? Can we look into that together? Can we investigate this? Or who do you think I should go to talk about this in further detail? How do we overcome this next time? And really being open to receiving the feedback so that people can feel like it's not a personal attack,
Right.
but an effort to, again, pull on the same side of the rope.
Yeah, and to grow. I mean, honestly, at the end of the day, what you want, I feel like anytime I'm part of a project and I'm done with the project, what I want to know is how I can grow. Have I
Right.
grown myself as a professional? Did I do
Absolutely.
enough to lift those next to me? And if I didn't, how can I do that moving forward? And that
Yeah.
those are great questions that should be asked of not just the project manager, but really everybody involved in that group, because it's not just the project manager. You're leading the project, but everybody has a stake in what they're doing, as we were talking at the beginning, and
Right.
that's meeting those goals and setting and getting to that expected finish line. But if I don't pull my weight, or if I'm half pulling my weight, if you know what I mean, then I need to be called out on it, or maybe I should call myself out on it. I don't know.
Mhm.
It's like you said, there's two sides to every coin, and the flip side of things. But I think feedback, regardless of positive or negative, is still should be taken. But Derrick, this has been awesome talking about remote IT
Yeah.
projects. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I feel like we could probably talk about this for a couple more hours, but I know you got stuff to do, so I don't want to keep you.
No, I appreciate the opportunity to talk, and I always enjoy this when we get a chance to do it. So thank you for having me again. I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening in to this week's edition of Ask Anything, presented by Moser Consulting. We hope you enjoyed listening to Derrick Spires talk to us about how to manage remote IT projects. Be sure to join us next time as we dive even deeper with our resident experts on what they're currently working on. Don't forget to share your ideas or topics with us on social media. In the meantime, please remember to give us a rating and subscribe to our feed wherever you get your podcasts. Until then, so long, everybody.